Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another Thursday lunchtime lecture. It's really great to be welcoming so many of you back to our lecture today. I've just been looking through the comments already coming in, so it's wonderful to be welcoming people from across the United Kingdom, as well as people internationally. So a warm welcome to those of you joining us today. If this is your first time joining us today, do let us know, do comment away, and do let us know where you're watching from. We'd love to say hello. So today we are joined by Kirsty Hartsiotis. Now, Kirsty is going to be talking to us about a really interesting topic today, which is about arts and crafts World War I memorials in the Cotswolds. Our Chief Executive, Peter Ayres, is going to tell you a little bit more about Kirsty shortly. But for those of you who are joining for the first time, as usual, I'm just going to explain how these lectures work so that you can get the most out of them. So these lectures are live streamed on Facebook. You can only watch them on our Facebook page. So please, if you ever see anybody posting any links in here telling you can watch it elsewhere, please don't click them because you can only watch them on our Facebook page. Now, if you've got any problems finding the stream or anything like that, just send us a direct message and we'll be on hand to help you out. Now, if you like and follow the Church's Conservation Trust Facebook page, you will get a notification from Facebook whenever we go live, or specifically when we do these live streams. We've created a video which explains how that process works, and it's almost a step-by-step guide. So do click on the video bio to get a link to that video. As always, one of the best things about these lectures is that there is plenty of time at the end of the lecture to ask our guest lecturers some questions. So please do comment with your questions throughout the lecture. Now, if you're liking these lectures, please do hit that like button, share them with your friends and family, and also do check out our upcoming lectures. Over the last week, we've added about another 4 lectures, so we've got a couple more to add for December, but do look on our Facebook events page. Again, please do invite your friends, share these events, because we'd love to welcome as many people as possible to these lectures. Now, if you do enjoy these lectures, also please do consider supporting us in our work. We look after 356 historic churches across the country, and this collection is likely to grow. Now, if you can donate in a variety of ways, you can text CCT to 70331, and now that will give us a gift of £3. But if you think these lectures are worth a bit more than £3, you can text CCT to 70191, and that will give us a gift of £10. Now, you can also donate completely securely through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk, or you can consider joining as a member. And I know a lot of people have taken us up on this special membership offer. So again, if you've joined us as a member recently, do let us know, and a warm welcome to those who have joined us in the last few weeks. But if you sign up by direct debit from as little as £3.50 a month, we will send you a free copy of Matthew Burns' Beautiful Church book, which has some amazing photography in and some amazing stories about churches that we at the Church's Conservation Trust have shared over the last 50 years. But as I said, if you've got any questions, please do send us a direct message. If you've got any ideas for future lectures, we want to hear from you. So do comment away. But I hope you enjoyed today's lecture. I'm going to pass you over now to our Chief Executive, Peter Ayres, who's going to tell you a bit more about our work at the Trust and some of the challenges we've been facing recently.
Hello, everybody, and welcome again. I've really been enjoying the idea that these aren't lunchtime lectures for everybody, but in fact could represent breakfast or indeed brunch to you who are joining us from different time zones across the world. So please just pick your most appropriate meal that's closest to the lecture, and I hope you enjoy it. So hello, and those of you probably seen me before, and those of you who are new, my name is Peter Ayres. I'm the Chief Executive of the Church's Conservation Trust. We're a charity who was set up over 50 years ago to save historic places of worship that were no longer used for regular worship. So we basically take on these buildings that are the best examples of historic parish churches across the country, and we save them in perpetuity on behalf of the nation. We've got a collection of 356 of them, and we take on roughly about 2 or 3 more every year. So we have a pipeline of sites coming to us. Now, this global pandemic has affected people right across the world in lots of different ways, and we have been no exception to that. We have something like a £500,000 hole in our income this year, which we're trying to fill because we haven't been able to do our regular fundraising events and our commercial work which is usually having events taking place, and also just wall safe money. As I said, I think last week, we've got a £78,000 hole in our just people donating coppers into the wall safe in our churches because people haven't been able to go out there. So your donations and your support is very warmly welcomed to the work that we undertake. Now, we've got a second lockdown going on in the UK, in England, sorry, in England at the moment. And that means that we've had to think very hard about what we do. Do check our website, because a number of our churches are actually open for independent prayer, as is allowed under these things. So do keep checking on our website and having a look. Now, obviously, this week has been a week of memorial, yesterday being Remembrance Day. And so this is a very fitting lecture to have on this day. Well, on the 12th, I suppose, the day after. And I speak to you, I'm very excited about this lecture because I keep spotting these arts and crafts war memorials all over the place, and I'm fascinated to hear more about them. I'm very, very proud to be speaking to you from the town of Northampton, which has a very fine Lutyens War Memorial in the town centre. Now, my claim is here, and whether I'm right or not, maybe Kirsty can fill you in on, but the cenotaph in Whitehall Lutyens always intended to put stone flags, painted flags on the cenotaph, and was overruled by the War Office. Now, in Northampton, you can actually see those stone painted flags on Lutyens' fantastic war memorial that's there. So, and Kirsty, you probably can't see her, but she's nodding. So that's great news to hear that that's a good thing. So we're really pleased to have Kirsty Harsitosis with us today. She's a writer and a storyteller, but also the curator of designated arts and crafts movement at the Wilson Art Gallery and Museum in Cheltenham. She recently had a major exhibition on Ernest Gimson, who I think you'll be talking about later on as well. Observation, Imagination and Making. She's the newsletter editor of the Society of Decorative Art Collections, the author of 5 books about folklore, and a regular columnist for Cotswold Life and other publications. She's also quite prolific on Twitter if you want to follow her as well. Her research interests include the private press movement of the 1880s to the 1930s, the arts and crafts movement in the Cotswolds, particularly, I'm pleased to say, churches and their fittings and First World War memorials. So you're in good hands for a very topical lecture for today. So Kirsty, thank you so much for sparing the time to join us, and I hope everyone out there enjoys. Please don't forget to support our work, and I'm sure George will remind you of how you can donate, and you can in fact join us as well. So over to you, Kirsty, and thank you again for sparing the time to do this for us.
It's a real pleasure. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, George. It's really exciting to be presenting this talk to you today. I'm been working on it for a couple of years, on and off. I had a big Gimson project last year, which took up most of my time. So I've been able to really come back to it this year with the unfortunate circumstances that we found ourselves in. It's very much a work in progress, so please bear with me. And I'm going to share my screen now so that we can start going through my lovely slides. And hopefully now you can see that full screen. Great. So 2 years ago, I and many other museum curators found ourselves at the end of 4 long years of commemorating the First World War. In my museum, my colleague and I put together a display about the end of the conflict. In truth, we were quite relieved and were looking forward to moving on to other things after 4 years. However, as I put together my part of the display, I found myself kind of sucked into another world, the world of the aftermath of a crisis, where a grieving and a struggling nation seeks to make sense of its loss. And I soon came to realize, and I read that that people, from politicians to artists, from soldiers to grieving mothers, had been trying to make sense of this throughout the First World War, and that the memorialized outpourings that still stand and are still remembered and venerated more now than 100 years on was simply one of many endpoints in that journey. As we struggle to make sense of the crisis in which we find ourselves, the mind, or at least my mind anyway, is constantly turning to what will happen afterwards. And we know from crises like this that we will eventually get there, and there will be a lot of memorials, I suspect, to raise then too. In this talk, I'm going to look at war memorials in the Cotswolds and elsewhere in Gloucestershire. The Cotswolds being in the kind of northern part of the southwest of the country, the counties of Gloucestershire, and bordering on Worcestershire, Warwickshire, Oxfordshire, and Bath and North East Somerset and Wiltshire. So quite a lot of different areas. I'm going to focus mostly on Gloucestershire though. And I'll be looking at those memorials designed by architects and designers who have some affiliation to the arts and crafts movement. In part, the Cotswolds, which you can see on the slide in front of you, a view looking down towards, though you can't see it, the town of Winchcombe in the North Cotswolds, because there are a large number, and I don't know yet whether it's a disproportionate number, of arts and crafts war memorials in the area. There are over 600, quite a few more than 600 First World War memorials in Gloucestershire alone. And although my colleague in this enterprise, Liz Dobson, and I are still compiling our figures at present, more than 70 of those are by arts and crafts designers or by those affiliated or interested in the movement. I expected to get up to about 100 or so memorials on the list by the time we finished our number crunching. And there are more in the other counties that, as I say, border the Cotswolds. But why is that? This slide shows you a number of people who moved to the Cotswolds in the 1890s. And one of the reasons why there are so many arts and crafts memorials in Gloucestershire is because there were a lot of arts and crafts designers living in the area. Firstly, in the Sapperton area, and Sapperton, you have to remember, is one of those CCT churches that I would encourage you to visit. And that's between Stroud and Cirencester, kind of midway in the Cotswolds. So we have here going, I'm going to try the laser pointer for the first time, so bear with me. We have here Sidney Barnsley, Ernest Gimson, and Ernest Barnsley with his young family and with their housekeeper, Lucy Morley. And they all moved to the Cotswolds in the very early 1890s to seek a simple life living in the countryside. They'd been previously in London and in Birmingham and were all city-born men. They lived the rest of their lives in Gloucestershire. Secondly, up in the north of the Cotswolds, around Chipping Campden, also still in Gloucestershire, there was the group based around the architect and designer C.R. Ashby's Guild of Handicraft. They rocked up in the town in 1902, having been formed in 1888 in the East End of London. And the men that you can see here are standing in Chipping Campden. They are members of the guild. This picture is often called Cockneys in Arcadia. And again, C.R. Ashby and the men who went with him were again looking for that simple life in the countryside. These places are still centres for art and craft to this day, more than 100 years on. Now, I'm going to be looking at a lot of different types of memorial, but what we won't be seeing is the big town and city memorials, not in this particular talk. These are going to be smaller towns and village memorials, like this one at Duntisbourne Abbots near Cirencester by the architect Alfred Pole, who lived nearby near Sapperton. They are structures that we walk past all the time: crosses, plaques, gates, buildings. For most of the year, we don't pay them any mind at all. I've just been reading about the Lutyens War Memorial in York, a place that I lived for about 6 years when I was in my 20s and still visit regularly. And the railway memorial to the LNER, I've walked past hundreds of times. It's right next to the station, unsurprisingly. I'd never really clocked it as a war memorial until I started this project. So I'm hoping that with this project that I'll start to encourage people to look and to see the war memorials around them, whether by arts and crafts designers or not, as works of art as well as commemorative pieces. Now, larger places like York followed the style suggested so successfully by Edwin Lutyens with the cenotaph in London, and his many, many other memorials, such as at Northampton, as mentioned by Peter, at home, abroad, and on the battlefield cemeteries of Flanders, with the war stone, the laurel wreath, etc. This rather unglamorous slide is not typical of the slides I'm going to be showing you, shows you a very quick snap of the Leicester War Memorial, which is one of his most impressive war memorials in the country. You can see it's a memorial arch inspired by triumphal arches. You can see it's white. You can see it's clean lines, relatively clean anyway, and how simple it is. Very classical. So too the monument in Cheltenham, where I work. Certainly Lutyens-esque, though designed by a local firm, R.L. Bolton and Sons, with a plain classical looking obelisk. And you can just see on the slide there is a sword with a laurel wreath around it, and then the huge roll of honour underneath it, listing 1,250 names from Cheltenham carved there into the stone, and around it an area for solemn ceremony. Gloucestershire has two Lutyens memorials itself. This one is at Miserdon, using a design that was rolled out across the country, the War Cross. Almost certainly commissioned because Lutyens knew the Lord of the Manor, Noel Wills of Miserdon Park, which had been damaged as it happened by fire in 1919, just before this memorial was commissioned. Lutyens did the repair work and thence did the War Memorial. It's just outside the churchyard. So this is facing Miserdon Church, outside so that it doesn't pick up on any conflict inside the village between different kinds of churchgoers, perhaps. The other memorial I think is actually a little bit more interesting, and that is at Nether Swell, right in the middle of the Cotswolds in the Honeypot region around Stow-on-the-Wold, a very beautiful village. And this war memorial is not near the church, it's in the village green. It's a secular war memorial. Again, it's classical, echoes funerary monuments of the 18th and 19th centuries, with its flaming urn ringed around with a laurel wreath. Symbolizing perhaps eternal remembrance and new life, combined with a victory laurel wreath that you can see, very similar to the ones on the Lutyens memorials. Or, quote, the indistinguishable flame of justice and a symbol of continuing struggle. Like Miserdon, the contact came through a moneyed contact of Lutyens, Mark Fenwick, for whom Lutyens had remodelled his house Abbotswood, which is very close to Nether Swell. Now, of course, what I don't know at this stage in my investigations is what the villagers thought of these impositions. Were they pleased to have a nationally famous architect doing their war memorial? And were they pleased to have his contact putting in a substantial amount of the funding for it? Or was there resentment that this had been imposed upon them? Things to find out. This is the War Memorial at Ozilworth in Gloucestershire, which is a CCT church, again to show you the classical influence that we perhaps, I think, come to expect of a lot of World War I memorials, with a double laurel wreath in this case. So this is one that you can go and see as part of the CCT. I went there a couple of weeks ago and found that it had this war memorial, so I photographed it for the lecture. But now I'm going to move on to those actual arts and crafts ones. I would say that Lutyens is not necessarily an arts and crafts architect at this stage in his career. He had moved on from that movement that he'd started in. The arts and crafts movement had grown out of the writing and work of John Ruskin, and particularly this man, William Morris, who's in his 50s in the 1880s in this photograph. He advocated that we should spend our time in useful work, not useless toil, and believed in creating as much as possible through handcraft, many of which he revived in his business, Morris and Company, which he started in 1862. Sold stained glass, wallpaper, textiles, furniture. It will pop up time and again in our churches. Theirs was a reaction against both the cheap and often tawdry products of industrialization in the 19th century, but also the way that people were being forced to work within that system. His famous maxim, have nothing in your house that you do not know to be useful or believe to be beautiful, could equally apply to his thoughts about church art. He was an avid conservationist himself, founding Society for the Protection of Ancient Buildings, which was mainly thinking about churches when it first started, and he himself became an ardent and revolutionary socialist. He inspired and befriended a group of younger architects, art workers and designers who began to form groups to create and sell their decorative arts, like the Art Workers Guild, formed in 1884, and the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society in 1887. And this is really the beginning of the arts and crafts movement. This is the interior of Brockhampton Church in Herefordshire, one of the key solely arts and crafts churches, designed by one of the spokespeople of the movement, W.R. Letherby, in 1901-2. These young men and women developed an ethos rather than a style, with a belief in handcraft being good for the soul and creating better objects than machine-made items, in reviving traditional techniques, in going out into nature and taking inspiration from it, in studying and drawing the designs of the past, but not slavishly imitating them, in simplifying design where appropriate, and throwing lashings of ornament at it where it was appropriate as well. It grew to be the dominant style, or one of the dominant styles, in Britain by the turn of the century. And it's generally thought, though, to have died away by the end of the First World War. But the sheer number of arts and crafts war memorials after the war, and many more in that style, shows that it's not true that it had gone by that time, or at least it's a formidable last gasp. In 1916, the Arts and Crafts Exhibition Society, working against all the odds and all hands on deck from the older and female members, put on a tour de force show of their work from the past 40 odd years at the Royal Academy. Famously, and as listed here on this slide in the introduction to the catalogue to the exhibition, a young soldier returned on leave cried out when on entering the exhibition, "Thank God there are people who care for these things. After the war, it will be too late." Would history prove him wrong? The provision of war memorials across the country. The Imperial War Museum now lists, as you can see here on their website in its register, more than 60,000 World War I memorials. And there are actually more than this that are not on this register that I know about, which means there must be quite a few more, as I wouldn't claim to know very much at all. Art suddenly took on more meaning to the wider British public, as each place and group was responsible for commissioning its own memorial, raising the money, selecting the type of memorial, selecting the designer, the maker, the design, the inscriptions, everything pertaining to it. And arts and crafts designers were very keen indeed to participate and guide, and I have to say, patronise. This is Arthur Clutton Buck on his hopes that war memorials of good design would cause, quote, "the taste of the man in the street to grow into being a help rather than a thing to fight as it is today." When in 1916 came the first debates about war memorials, the architects and designers of the movement, keenly aware that they could benefit society with their works, rather than being an interesting backwater in the life of our country. The designers were on all the committees, the Civil Arts Association, the Royal Academy War Memorials Committee. There were publications, meetings, exhibitions about what might be suitable as war memorials, so that the dead are worthily commemorated for our sakes and for the sakes of those to come. There were a lot of debates about what memorials should be, but most communities elected to make a commemorative gesture that was a place to gather and remember, as we'll see, whether in the secular or the ecclesiastical space. We'll start then with that most expected of war memorial designs, the memorial cross, found both in the churchyard and without. We remember Lutyens' classicised simplified one. This is the other really famous one by Reginald Blomfield. It's the cross of sacrifice, seen at many of the war grave cemeteries in Flanders. So a very simple cross with a sword upon it. Now, these are very simple from these more classicising architects, but they've actually started out in the arts and crafts tradition. And while we might expect arts and crafts designers to go in the opposite direction and lavish ornament, it's not necessarily the case, as we shall see, as they both thought about the precise application of simplicity or splendour. Our starting point is going to be Fairford near the River Thames, and the key arts and crafts designer Ernest Gimson, who had followed the path of simplicity in both his life and in its design to its zenith, but was not afraid of using luxurious detailing in memorials, such as this altar cross designed in memory of Keith Debenham of the Debenham department store family, who died from wounds inflicted in Iraq in 1916. And this is for St. Peter's Vere Street in London. And this is ebony and ivory, and the red that you can see here just about is coral. Gimson was selected to carry out the design at Fairford and had completed a design before being taken ill in early summer 1919. Sadly died that August, and this was his last design to be carried out. His assistant, the architect Norman Dewson, and Gimson's old friend Sidney Barnsley, who you might remember from the photograph, picked up the baton for him. But there was a bit of toing and froing before the design was approved. It cost £300, and that's just the design before you get onto the making of it. And the parish had to raise this money by subscription. This was common, and cost is one of the big issues in the raising of war memorials. Sidney Barnsley lobbied for his friend's design. And in November 1919, the go-ahead was given. Sidney Barnsley wrote, "I'm pleased to hear that your committee approved and selected Gimson's design for the Fairford Cross. Until yesterday, I had almost given up hope. Norman Dewson was happy to accept to do the work." This is his letter from January. He was already by this time the weary battler of war memorial disputes. "I am sorry," he says in this letter, "that there is some dissatisfaction about putting up a cross at all. It is unfortunate that in almost every parish difficulties have arisen about the form of war memorial. In your case, it would be a great misfortune if Mr. Gimson's design was not used, as his power of design and deep knowledge of Cotswolds tradition were quite without parallel." After delivering this riposte, he did sweeten the pill by knocking 50 quid off the price. The form of the memorial is reminiscent, as many arts and crafts crosses are, of old churchyard and wayside crosses, with the cross within almost a lantern on the top of the shaft. And then round the base, we have the names of the fallen of Fairford. In fact, they're round the top part of the base, and the plaque you can see on the bottom part is the Second World War memorial that has been added to it later on. The memorial also has oak leaves on it, this time making up a little tree of life on the cross lantern at the top, symbolizing the rood on which Christ died, the death and rebirth central to Christian faith, without being overtly churchy. You'll have seen from the slide before that this sits just inside and almost without the churchyard. But this oak leaf motif, it reoccurs in Gimson's design, but here it's really a way of delivering appropriate symbolism without offending lower church, or indeed no church, denizens of the village. The hooded cross forms a traditional style based on medieval churchyard crosses, but with the additional benefit that it keeps the rain off the fragile design. A common variant of this is the Celtic Cross. And this one is designed by Sidney Barnsley at Minchinhampton, which is near Stroud. And it's a design that shows both sacrifice, as shown in the cross, but also eternal life, as shown in the circle. So very popular for war memorials indeed. Now, Sidney Barnsley, as a friend of Gimson, he talked to him every day about design outside his workshop. And so their designs are actually very similar. As you can see, if we look at the design for this one, which is at the museum where I work in Cheltenham, it bears a distinct similarity to Gimson's design, as you can see here with the oak leaves as the tree of life. Now, as the names for the Minchinhampton dead, a much bigger place than Fairford, wouldn't fit on the cross, Barnsley also designed that other key part of a war memorial, which is the roll of honour, the list of names of those who fell. This is in the market building of the Market House of Minchinhampton. The fire engine had to be evicted for this to go there, but I think was given a better place to be housed. Another example, a bit more canonical of the style, is at Aston Subedge, probably almost certainly by Guy Dauber, another arts and crafts architect, who, like Lutyens, was well known on the country house circuit. And in this case, the commissioner was the 5th Earl of Harrowby of the Norton estate, who, as his own memorial says, built the club, new farms and cottages, and adapted many more, and planted some 100,000 trees on the Norton estate, and loved every sod of his soil. Here you can see that in this design, it incorporates some of the key tropes that we've already seen of the cross of sacrifice, seen here again within the laurel wreath like at Cheltenham, but very small and subtle is this victory idea, with the sacrifice and eternal life here much more to the fore. Sometimes the arts and crafts tradition of reuse and conservation was brought in at Saintbury in the North Cotswolds near Chipping Campden, and also a CCT church, which is an absolute showcase of some wonderful arts and crafts items, both inside and without the church. I do recommend that you go. The reason there were quite a lot of these arts and crafts designs there is because the vicar befriended the C.R. Ashby and the Guild of Handicraft when they were chucked out, essentially, of St James's Church in Chipping Campden for doing things like going on cycling trips on a Sunday, and for really just being a bit too bohemian for Chipping Campden. Here in Saintbury, they were welcomed. And Alec Miller, who designed the War Memorial here out of an old churchyard cross, actually met his wife at Saintbury, so it remained a special place for him. You can see that it's much more religious cross than the ones we've seen before. It's much more like a medieval churchyard cross. It recalls for me those Breton Calvaries where you have the Virgin and Child, the crucifixion, and although not in this case, you would have a Pietà as well. Sadly, though, you can see that Miller's tender carving is rather eroded away. He was the main sculptor of the Guild of Handicraft, did a lot of churchyard. And I understand there is a fund to restore this cross. Please do investigate on the websites and help it be restored. Inside the church as well, there's a World War I memorial, a slightly odd piece, also by Alec Miller, and to Richard Philip Nason, the son of the vicar, or one of the sons of the vicar, who died in early 1918. This memorial is put up in memory of him and his father, who died in 1923. It's got a copy of Jan van Eyck's famous Ghent altarpiece in it, and is a reredos in the North Chapel, showing that you can have all different kinds of memorials inside the church as well as outside. And the ones inside the church do often, when there's something like a reredos, tend to be a personal memorial or a stained glass window, say, to an individual. Now, Alec Miller was also involved in a completely different type of memorial, one that did often prove quite controversial, as did any memorial that was situated wholly within the auspices of the church, even these ones which are right on the edge, a Lichgate at Overbury, just over the border in Worcestershire, between Tewkesbury and Evesham, in the shadow of Breedon Hill. This is, as I say, a Lichgate. It's the place at the entrance to the churchyard where once a funeral party would rest the coffin. And you can see a coffin rest here in the middle, although the likelihood is that no coffin has really been placed here, and that this has been placed here as a reference to and a memory of the lost men of the two villages represented here, Overbury and Conderton, but also a reference perhaps to the altar that was Lutyens' warstone, seen on so many war memorials around the country and abroad. It was commissioned, again, a commission from an influential friend of the arts and crafts movement, the Holland Martins of Overbury Court, whose son Geoffrey had died in 1918. Age just 19. Rob and Nell Holland Martin were supporters of the arts and crafts and were friends with the Ashbys at Chipping Campden, Rob being a director of the company from 1898, and being the one, in fact, who had suggested Chipping Campden as a place to go to Ashby for the guild that they moved to in 1902. sorry, my mouse has gone a bit strange. But I can click on with the clicker, so it's okay. Leave the mouse alone now. Overbury is almost a model arts and crafts village, thanks to the efforts of Rob's uncle. First Richard Norman Shaw and then Ernest Newton. Other key designers of the late 19th century had built a number of buildings like this village hall. Rob inherited the estate and continued the work from 1916, and the War Memorial is one of the key pieces that he provided. It's designed by Sir Herbert Baker, who had worked with Lutyens on his New Delhi project, but has spent most of his career in South Africa. Back in England, just before the First World War, he was responsible then afterwards for a number of war memorials, such as this one at neighbouring Kemerton, this case made by a local man, Messrs. E.T. Taylor of Tewkesbury. At Overbury, Baker used the natural environment to create an atmosphere of peace and tranquility by using the stream that you can see here with benches inside the war memorial. There are benches on either side, and it's allowed the veterans and mourners to sit and contemplate the memorial to the sound of this babbling brook. Very peaceful indeed. Internally, though, there is subtle symbolism. These carvings by Alec Miller, little reliefs, so I think they're only about this big, show obviously the crucified Christ, and we think the resurrected, risen Christ, offering hope after death, after suffering. It's thick with inscriptions as well. This one's showing them on the roof beams. The one as you cross into the church there at the back of the picture, saying, "Through the grave and gate of death we pass to our joyful resurrection." The coffin rest is inscribed with the names of the 27 villagers who died, of course, but also with poetry, lines from Blake's Jerusalem, and exhortations to dedicate one's life to the cause for which the men died. We think it looks like the inscription was once coloured, and so would have looked a little bit different, with, we think, green and red colouring. On the exterior, there are two angels, photographed rather dramatically by Liz a couple of weeks ago, just before the lockdown, in the absolute pouring rain. Liz deserves a medal for going around and photographing quite a few of the war memorials appearing in this and other talks that I'm giving at this time. I think this one shows it very dramatically. This is the angel of victory, or possibly peace. And you think at first glance it's just a simple lich gate, like any other, but they've really used symbolism there to make you think, and for it to be a place of comfort. It's almost a practical memorial, offering a place of rest and contemplation. Now, it's common to find quite a lot of different war memorials in one locality, a secular memorial and any number of religious ones, both within and without the church. So I'm going to look at a few, quickly at a few examples inside churches, looking at a range of different types and styles and artists. This one, apologies for the small image. Liz did actually go to this church, but it was undergoing restoration, and the memorial was covered up by a dust sheet. Ah, well, we shall go back. It's by a woman artist, Faith Brooks of Barford. Quite unusual, but certainly not completely unusual. Mary Watt designed the memorial at Compton in Surrey. Ellen Mary Rope designed several memorials in Suffolk. Kathleen Scott, the widow of Scott of the Antarctic, designed the one in Huntingdon, and others beside. This one is at Cherrington, just over the border in Warwickshire. And Faith herself lived at Warwick, or near Warwick. She was the daughter of Reverend William Ingham Brooke, who was the vicar of Barford Church, and he and his wife were great suffragists. And so they're likely to have supported their daughter's artistic ambitions. You can see we have a very typical St. George killing a dragon on this memorial, and that the lettering that I hope you can see is in a very arts and craftsy kind of style, with the O's crossing each other and other little quirks. So she almost certainly had formal training in design. We'll have to find out more about her. In Dumbleton, north of Winchcombe, and at Maisie-Hampton, near Fairford, we'll find these parish war memorials by Norman Dewson, who was Gimson's assistant and took over the design of the Fairford Memorial. Typical vine leaf carving of church art from the arts and crafts movement on the Dumbleton one, and it may not actually be by Dewson, however, because the dedication notice in the paper said that the memorial tablet was made from part of a reredos that was formerly in a church at nearby Wood Norton House, which had been recently demolished, the church that is. It's subtly done, as the cross, as you can see, is the same at the one at Maisie-Hampton. And it's very legible, which is something that Gimson had always put forward. No fancy lettering here. Dumbleton is also a village cross by a different designer, Ninian Comper. And the villagers, although they used different designers, saw them very much as having a twofold character, it says in the dedication notice. Rather different is this war memorial at St Mary's in Berkeley, towards the south of Gloucestershire, near the River Severn, north of Bristol. Here the war memorial has its own chapel at the end of one of the aisles, and is this complex gilded triptych with the roll of honour underneath it. The other one that you can see in the photograph is actually the roll of honour for the Second World War. It's all by Henry Payne, with, I presume, assistance from his wife Edith, who generally made his frames. He had been a teacher at the Birmingham School of Art, the other and second centre of the arts and crafts movement, and is best known as a stained glass designer, as we'll see. He moved to the Cotswolds in 1909 and continued his work there, based at Amberley on Minchinhampton Common. I'm afraid I don't know yet, because I haven't been able to get to the record office in the lockdown at Gloucester, where the information is, as to why this was commissioned from him or who by. Was it to do with Berkeley Castle, which is so very next door to the church? The faculty notice for the war memorial says, an oak reredos and altar in the church, the names of the fallen to be inscribed on a panel, which, to be frank, is a lot simpler than what we've got here. It's much more elaborate, very high church. You have the three figures of St. Michael, of peace and justice. And you can see that St. Michael there is killing a dragon-like Satan. Peace has her dove, blind justice her sword and scales, very much the look of an early Renaissance painting. But the flowers at their feet are all native ones. You can see here lady's smock, which has an association with the Virgin Mary. And also here at the feet of both Justice and Michael, you have viola, meaning purity, joy and mourning, sorry, heartsease rather, purity, joy and mourning, relating to three stages of Mary's life. And these flowers, these native flowers, are very similar to what you get on medieval manuscript illustrations, and also were used by Morrison Company in tapestry and stained glass. But you will note, though, this rather suspiciously looking, German-looking helmet on the ground right next to the vanquished head of Satan. One thing that was generally not seen amidst all this symbolism and medievalism were contemporary images of soldiers. It was thought that this was a little bit unsuitable, and the recommended ideal was to use, as at Berkeley, symbolical parallels from sacred history or legends of the saints, or rather than an attempt to depict actual occurrences or personalities of the war. This, though, is at Rodborough near Stroud, another Henry Payne piece, a window this time, showing just that. It's dedicated to Second Lieutenant Norman Steele, who was killed aged 20 at Passchendaele in 1917, as well as to all the rest of the Rodborough men lost. However, it's not all as it seems. As you see, this war memorial was actually put up in 1939, in fact, after the beginning of the Second World War. And by now it had become more normal to show contemporary scenes. As an aside, not so far out of the Cotswold, is a more contemporary window from the 1920s, I think, at St Michael at the North Gate, Oxford, by Beatrice French, which shows the conventional figure of St George and the dragon here, but also shows in the background the desolation of France, with two ruined buildings taken from contemporary photographs. As you see, this one here is Albert, with its famous fallen spire of a gilded statue of the Virgin and Child, which didn't fall for another 2 years after this bombing in 1916. It seems that ruins were more acceptable than fallen soldiers in the memorials at this time, although you do see them in some arts and crafts memorials, such as that at Lapworth in Warwickshire. More typical, though, is this window, again by Henry Payne, this from 1926 at Chipping Campden in St James Church, which has such a panoply of symbolism. You'd be hard pressed to recognise it as a war memorial if it didn't have the words "in memory of those who fell, in thankfulness to God for peace and for the lives of those came back, AD 1914 to 18. In fact, everything in the window has symbolic resonance to the war, but it can't always been clear. Is there's actually a booklet from the time detailing precisely what all of that symbolism is. For example, as here, Elijah represents those divinely protected from danger during the war. And all around him, you can see there is nature, which perhaps, although it's a really key arts and crafts trope, is doubly resonant with all the destruction of the natural world that had taken place and was now in the 1920s rejuvenating the war cemeteries in France with the iconic poppy. I'll close, well-ish, with another war memorial at Chipping Campden, the Town Memorial, which is not near the church. It sits next to the Market Hall. Its story encapsulates many of the issues of war memorial design, and it's by Frederick Landseer Griggs, who designed a huge number of war memorials in the Cotswold region. He was an artist and illustrator, and he moved to Chipping Campden in 1904 and never left. As the years went by, his idealism was kind of eroded away when the Guild of Handicraft left in 1908, and particularly with the outbreak of the war. This is his Christmas card for 1918, sent with new hope for the year ahead. And you can see the cross on it looks very much like his war memorial. It was quite a difficult commission, though. He put forward this design, he donated it, so no charge like there was in Fairford from Gimson, but Camden was not the paradise that he hoped it would be. Two opposing factions arose, one of which, led by Mr. Dewhurst, wanted a nursing station in the town, very practical. And I have to say there were grudges at play, not necessarily against Griggs, but just generally within the town. There were quite a lot of guild members and arts and crafts adherents still remaining in the town, and they rallied around Griggs. Stained glass designer Paul Woodruff, a fellow Catholic, as Griggs was Catholic, sent Griggs' designs to W.R. Letherby, the designer and head of the Central School of Arts and Crafts. And Letherby sent back the following words: "This is one of the most appropriate and beautiful memorials he had ever seen." However, Griggs had not served during the war and was a Catholic. Objections were raised against his character for these reasons in a committee meeting, and then shouted down. The design was passed by a large majority, but Griggs was deeply upset. He wrote a jokey but underlyingly bitter letter to a friend in mock rural dialect, saying, "Mr. Chandler," he told one man who said Griggs had no self-respect if he was willing to do it. He said, "Oh, surprised are you? What surprises me is that you don't see how Griggs would see the lot of you in hell afore he'd give in to the Philistines over Camden." In fact, this is an extremely elegant war memorial, as was noted. It's full of patriotic detail, 8 sides decorated with various arms of England, from the 3 lions and Union Jack that you can see here to the arms of St Edmund, 3 crowns of East Anglia, and St Edward the Confessor, a cross with 5 martlets, all previous patron saints of England. But the shenanigans didn't end with the erection of it. His opponents even objected to the kind of sand he used to make the mortar. And the doctor said, on being told that the memorial was beautiful, of course Griggs would see to that to advertise himself. Now, the kinds of memorials that we've been looking at were certainly not the only choice. There was a drive from all quarters, from returning servicemen to architects, to provide practical memorials of use to the community from which the lost men had come. W.R. Letherby, arts and crafts architect, as I've said, and was oftentimes a spokesman of the movement. And he said, there is a feeling in the air that we must advertise our regret and compassion in lavish oblations of marble, brass, and glass. Is this what the fallen themselves would have wanted? And that 4.5 years of war and destruction would be followed by a great outpouring of unproductive and indeed futile labour. This is the Memorial Hall in Badminton in South Gloucestershire. We don't yet know who the architect of this is, but you can see that they were clearly inspired by arts and crafts style, and it's very much a practical war memorial. Very much the kind of thing that a lot of arts and crafts lobbyists wanted: recreation grounds, cottages for veterans and the like. Many of the veterans agreed. Here at Oldbury-on-Severn, where incidentally there is a CCT church, St Arilda's, that you can go and see, we have again an anonymous, don't know the architect, building, but it was one that was funded by donations from returning servicemen out of their own demobilisation payments to create a place where they and other villagers could gather. And I've just found out a couple of days ago that Rodborough, where we saw the stained glass window, that was a suggestion that its war memorial, which is a very ordinary war memorial now, not to the ordinary villagers, that they thought that it should be a village hall. And a newspaper reports that the plans had been drawn up and a cost put forward by a Mr. Barnsley, which is probably either Sidney Barnsley, who designed the Minchinhampton War Memorial, or Ernest Barnsley, his brother, who'd already designed the village hall at Sapperton before the war. But sadly, it didn't come to pass. Perhaps it cost too much. One did get built, a practical memorial, but it was no longer a war memorial by the time it got built, because it wasn't built until 1934. It was built or designed by Ernest Gimson during the war for May Morris, who was the kind of lady of the manor at Kelmscott House after her father's death. And May Morris was the younger daughter of William Morris, and it's now the Morris Memorial Hall. And she did put forward the idea that this could be a war memorial almost to stop an issue that she was concerned about. There is a danger, she said, which makes me perfectly terrified, that money can be procured for a cheap arty building that will simply ruin the village. She wants the villagers to have a dignified monument to their friends who have died in the war. It's all very patronising indeed. And in the end, the war memorial idea was dropped, and a tablet is to be seen in Kelmscott Church. This is the memorial as built. Now, of course, by 1934, we were only a few years away from another war. Most of the Second World War dead were listed on the old war memorials. The memorials that were raised after that time were practical ones. We could say indeed that the NHS is one of those memorials to the Second World War. So the designers of the arts and crafts movement did not get their wish in changing the taste of the nation, I'm afraid. In fact, most war memorials were not done by arts and crafts men and women. However, in their mostly ignored rallying calls for practical buildings as commemoration, they were ahead of the curve. One last memorial, ending at another CCT church at Charfield near Wootton under Edge, whose memorial is by Percy B. Tubbs, an architect who was interested in the arts and crafts movement and employed several of the craftsmen used by Ernest Gimson. This memorial is interesting because, like the stained glass at Chipping Campden, it lists all who served, not just those who died. And all the memorials that the arts and crafts designers and all the other memorial makers did, the words of this title of this lecture from Reginald Blomfield, serve as a link between us and those who took part. He says, the memorials of these dark days and great days will stand to witness to our far off sons and daughters that their old forefathers did not live to no purpose and did not die in vain. Let us hope that the memorials of our own generation will do the same for our lost. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. That was that's been brilliant. And I know at the start of your lecture, you said you were hoping through your project and research to, make people aware about memorials that we so often walk past. And judging by the comments coming in on Facebook, you've certainly achieved that, and there's been a real appreciation for what you've shared with us today. So thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Everyone, we're about to dive into question time, but before we do that, if you have enjoyed this lecture, please do consider supporting us and making a donation to help us care for historic churches across England. As I said at the start of this section, you can do that in a few ways. You can donate securely through our website, which is visitchurches.org.uk, or you can become a member. You can join us and take advantage of a special membership offer we're running. So if you join us by direct debit from as little as just £3.50 a month, we will send you a free copy of Matthew Burns' Beautiful Churches book. And finally, if you've got a mobile phone with you, you can also send in a text message to make a donation. You can text CCT to 70331 to give us a gift of £3, or you can text CCT to 70191 to give us a gift of £10 if you think this lecture's been worth £10. But as I said, we're going to dive straight into question time. There's going to be some really interesting questions coming in already, Kirsty. So I'm going to dive straight in. Why were some memorials secular and some weren't in churches and churchyards?
This was a big debate at the time. Communities had their own choice of how they raised their memorials. And for example, at Minchinhampton, the town decided that they didn't want the memorial to go in the churchyard. They wanted it to be for everyone, and they wanted it to be really in the heart of the village. They put it on the high street. It's essentially a traffic roundabout now, but it's very, very visible within the secular environment, whereas the church is a bit off to the side. There is a First World War memorial there that was put up by a woman who lost 2 sons in the war, and she dedicates that also to everybody else who died at Minchinhampton. But it was considered in a lot of places, and particularly in larger places and in villages where you're much more likely to see them inside the bounds of the churchyard or inside the church itself, where you've got a much wider community than people who are simply members of the Church of England. And obviously at that time, quite a lot of the population still would have been members of the Church of England. But within larger places, there was a lot of toing and froing, that if a church was put forward as a place to have a memorial, then one of the non-conformist chapels would say, hi, 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 what about us? We should have a memorial. It should be in our place then. And so it was felt that in a lot of places that the best place to go would be not in the churchyard. And that is why I think you tend to see also a lot of memorials that are right on the edge of the churchyard as well, not only for ease of access for ceremonies, so that you don't have to go trudging through a muddy churchyard in November to get to the memorial. Like you see at Fairford, it's right on the edge. And there's one at Willersey, which is near to Broadway and Chipping Camden, which is literally on the wall of the churchyard. So half of it's in the churchyard and half of it is without the churchyard. And I really want to find out the story of why that happened, because it seems like there's a massive compromise going on there and possibly a battle. I could be wrong, but having seen what I've seen, there is quite a lot of dissent goes on. It was a huge amount of dissent. A lot of people putting forward these practical memorials, and for a various number of reasons, them not going ahead. People preferring to have a place to go to mourn. And in this case, often wanting a place that wasn't associated necessarily with one particular church.
Thanks, Kirsty. That's a brilliant answer. And I know from our own collection of churches, we've got quite a few where, as you've just said there, the actual memorials are on the edge of the churchyard. Mm-hmm. So that's really interesting. And thank you for sharing your knowledge on that. Are the creators of these memorials always both rooted in the practical arts, so being builders or architects, and also the fine arts, so sculpture or painters?
Not necessarily, no. So we saw, for example, at the one at Overbury, the Lich Gate, that it was designed by Herbert Baker, who was an architect, and he brought in an accomplished sculptor to do the work of the carving. Now, I would clarify that though and say that arts and crafts architects in particular had a much more holistic view of their own training, I suppose, in that a lot of these architects had trained themselves in a number of different crafts. They were inspired to do that from, a lot of them came out of the architectural schools of Sedding and Richard Norman, J.D. Sedding and Richard Norman Shaw, who also encouraged this and did this in their own practice of learning how to do the crafts. And it's something that William Morris advocated as well. So he himself, for example, taught himself how to embroider, which you wouldn't necessarily expect would be something that a man would do, but in fact Sedding did the same. And so they did have craft skills. So Ernest Gimson, for example, and Sidney Barnsley, who we met, are both furniture makers, but they themselves were not stone carvers. They didn't make those memorials. They were made by probably local masons who did quite a lot of the work of the actual masonry. I mean, it was, we don't like to talk about, you know, making money out of a crisis, but it was a really good opportunity after 4 years of difficulty for architects and masons and sculptors to make money. And you often see a group of people coming together. So at Stanway, which is again in the North Cotswolds, you have a war memorial designed by an architect, Stott, and then the sculpture is by a relatively well-known sculptor, Alexander Fisher, and the lettering done by somebody else again, the infamous Eric Gill. So you've got a lot of collaboration, and again, that's a real arts and crafts thing, is to bring together those who can to work together on a project, so that you've got people who are really highly skilled in their work. But yes, there is a certain amount of truth in that, the arts and crafts designers were multi-skilled.
Thanks, Kirsty. And once the memorials were actually constructed, obviously a lot of these, as you said, were built, you know, post 1918. How easy or how difficult was it to add names to the fallen from the Second World War?
It does depend. So you saw at the Berkeley War Memorial that what was decided there with the wonderful triptych and the gilded panel was absolutely rammed with names. There was no room on there for anybody post 1919, because war memorials usually take in through 1919 as well, from men who, you know, died of their wounds, sadly, and for things that were still kind of being mopped up at that point. But in Berkeley, within the War Memorial Chapel, you have another plaque in the same style, actually by two of Henry Payne's sons, which details that. However, at Fairford and a lot of the War Memorial crosses, there is space within the War Memorial, or for example at Charfield, there was space within the kind of the symbolic structure where people would gather to be able to insert more plaques. And that, I think, was the case at Overbury as well. So they simply took the War Memorial and added the names. I think part of the reasoning was that these had already become a focus for people's grief, and it seemed a bit pointless to a generation on create a whole new place to go to when it could be added to that place. So a lot of effort was made to add where you could to those war memorials, though sometimes it can look a bit tagged on. Sometimes great effort is made to tie them in to that 25-year-old style.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. I'm just aware of the time, so I'm just going to, we've got a couple more questions here. I'm going to merge this one into two here. Are you aware of any First World War memorials which are arts and crafts for thankful villages? And also, are you aware of any First World War memorials where the names of those who may have been shot for cowardice or desertion are also commemorated?
I have to confess that I'm going to go through that answer quite quickly, because I don't. Certainly in the Cotswolds, there were war memorials raised. There are 3 thankful villages, I think, in Gloucestershire, and they all have memorials, but none of those memorials, as far as I'm aware, are by arts and crafts designers. I simply don't know about the conscientious objectors and those who were shot for cowardice. I mean, my grandfather actually in the Second World War was a conscientious objector, something of which I'm extremely proud of. So I would like to think that the arts and crafts, many designers, many of whom were pacifists themselves. So for example, Joseph Southall, an artist in Birmingham, wrote and illustrated many books and pamphlets during the First World War about how awful it was, and also they're very socialist as well. So it's about bringing down, having no war and having no capitalism as well. But as far as I'm aware, he didn't design any war memorials. So I'm not quite sure of that, but it's certainly something that I'll be looking into, and I'll, if I can find out relatively soon, I will put something up on Facebook about that on the page. That's a really interesting question. And yeah, I think that's something that I have a personal interest in myself.
Thanks, Kirsty. And I think a nice one to finish on here, and I'm sorry if we haven't answered those questions, everyone, but I'll go through those comments and I'll try and get some answers for you. But what's your favourite arts and crafts memorial?
Oh, that's a really hard question. At this precise moment, it's probably Overbury. Both Liz and I are extremely keen on Overbury, but I'm not really quite sure. A couple of weeks ago, I probably would have said Stanway, which I didn't include in this talk. It's actually going to be in another talk that I'm doing on Monday about specifically Gloucestershire ones in slightly more detail, because it has this wonderful statue of George killing the dragon, which I don't really approve of. And it is just such a piece of bling. It's very exciting. But some of the stained glass windows to individual soldiers, such as the one that I mentioned in passing by R.J. Stubbington at Lapworth in Warwickshire, are absolutely stunning. I mean, the arts and crafts stained glass of this period up until into, you know, at least the 1930s, is there are a lot of war memorials, and they're really, really beautiful. In Gloucestershire, I also really like Fairford, because I'm very attached to Ernest Gimson, so I can't help myself there.
Well, I think
I could go on. I love them all.
Well, thanks so much, Kirsty, for your time today. And everyone, thank you so much for joining us today. Next week, we are going to be joined by Dr. Nicholas Thistlethwaite. He's going to be talking to us, and I will just read you the title of the lecture so I get it correct. The Box of Whistles, a short history of English church organs from 1500 to 1900. Now, Nicholas is going to be doing a whistle stop tour next week, explaining how the English organ evolved in parish churches, and that's going to be a really interesting lecture. So do join us next Thursday at 1 p.m. for that lecture. Now, if you've got any comments, if you've got any ideas for potential lectures, again, please do comment. We'd love to hear your suggestions. As I said, do go onto our events page. We've just put on another 4 or 5 brand new lectures for the coming weeks and going into December. And we've got a couple more special events in December that we're going to be releasing details about very, very shortly. But again, thank you, Kirsty, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for joining today. And we look forward to seeing you at another Thursday lunchtime lecture in the future. Take care, everyone.